Just tell us why. Why do you think that this COVID pandemic has disproportionately affected women more than men compared to other economic crises we've seen?
Well, I think it's a confluence of factors that have really come together to hit women harder. First is the fact that the pandemic has hit women harder because of the health consequences. So while male mortality has been is higher than female mortality, women bear all the responsibility for care. They care for ill family members. They have reduced financial security when men in their households pass away. They are responsible for their children. And because their situation in the labor market, they are in lower paying sectors of the economy. They may have businesses that are less profitable. They have reduced financial security. So the combination of the health crisis and the economic crisis has hit women in much harder ways. And there's a lot of different impacts that we could go into. For instance,
walk us through what the impact really is.
Yeah, so the first impact I would say is in the economic domain, and I already mentioned that. Increased job loss. Reports from around the world show that the sectors where women work have higher unemployment than the sectors where men work. So you're thinking about retail and tourism and hospitality and food, so retail and services. And those things aren't really coming back in very big numbers. Women tend to predominate in informal employment, and those jobs are very precarious. They don't have access to social protection and social assistance programs. So informal workers and when, for instance, markets shut down, women can't go out. That's another economic impact. There's health impacts that I mentioned. Services may be disrupted. For instance, hospitals, services like maternal and reproductive health services, and women may not be able to move around to get to those services. So those are health impacts. And we know in the education sphere that girls may be harder hit than boys. Girls may have to watch younger siblings. They may not have access to a smartphone in the household for distance learning. And we learned from previous crises like Ebola, for instance, or even SARS, that girls didn't return to school in the same numbers that boys did. And the final implication, I think, of the twin crises is what I call the shadow pandemic, and that's the increases in violence against women. With shutdowns, with reduced mobility, we have heard around the world increased reports to helplines, to shelters that increased reports of abuse. So these impacts are quite severe.
Caren, I want to talk about the digital divide because we know the pandemic has highlighted this issue. About 300 million women have no access to, mobile internet. I mean, is it about to get worse? And how do you even begin to address the issue?
So that's a really important issue. And I think the GSMA Foundation, the World Wide Web Foundation, have all estimated that, as you say, 300 million fewer women have access to internet. And we also have a big access in ownership and control over smartphones and mobile technology. And this is extremely important because with moving to remote options, the access to internet and phones is even more crucial. It's crucial to build back in terms of economic recovery. And all of the solutions for this crisis in terms of social protection, having access to digital payments, being able to receive cash over an e-wallet and so forth. We need to address that gender digital divide. And so governments are increasingly accelerating access to infrastructure, broadband. They're transferring their government to people payment platforms. They're making them digital. They're moving away from cash. And unless we put women's access to digital services at the heart of these new platforms, we're going to just exacerbate pre-existing inequalities. And the telecoms have a role to play. They have a role to play in providing, for instance, performance incentives and other things that can help households get the technology, keep the technology for men and women and boys and girls.
Caren, how is this playing out in countries like India, where women account for 50% of the population, but only less than 20% of economic activity? Is the government doing enough to perhaps bridge the gap or make it more palatable?
So we've been working with many governments in South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific in terms of how they can actually provide short-term temporary measures to help populations just survive, to be able to get them the health care that they need. So we've been providing a lot of support to governments to strengthen their health systems, but also to strengthen their social protection systems. And India is one of the countries where we have just financed actually a very large lending operation to help them extend social protection to many people who are formerly excluded, whether they're informal workers. And I have to say, India is a really interesting economy because the main needs, what the government did initially in the first part of the crisis was to provide food. That was particularly important because food systems were disrupted, and they're still providing food subsidies, whether it's in wheat or rice, and that's quite important. But they're also starting to provide cash. But I have to say that no government is there yet. We have too many people who are still excluded from those types of systems and need access. And I think the thing that's also probably very difficult is India, like many other countries, has a large proportion of women who are micro-entrepreneurs or self-employed, and they need this kind of support that small businesses need. They may not have access to capital, to liquidity. So those systems, the financial systems, also need to be strengthened to serve those segments of the population.
And Caren, the World Bank has been approving many loans out there amid this pandemic. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the ones that are actually gender responsive policies as well.
So that's a really great question. I think that the World Bank is making available up to $160 billion to countries who need and who want financial assistance. And we're making support available first and foremost to strengthen health systems, to provide necessary equipment, vaccines, and so forth. But then we're also providing support for governments to initiate the social protection, social assistance programs, and also then to help the private sector through our private sector arm, where we are making $8 billion more available to help support private firms. And I think for women and the gender gap, there's a number of things that I think are really important. There's 4 areas that governments need to focus on. The first is ensuring in the health sector continued access to reproductive and maternal health services, but also ensuring that there's adequate services for survivors of gender-based violence. Second of all, the social protection, which I mentioned, the governments need to extend those systems to the informally employed. Women are a larger proportion, as I mentioned, of informal workers, and they need to come into these systems. And besides social protection, community-based approaches, so local governments have a role in helping local governments to be able to provide food security, cash assistance, food for work, and so forth. The third thing that I think is really critical, and this is the area that's most missing, is support for care for children and care for dependents. Care is the invisible part of this pandemic. Women are spending twice the amount of time with school lockdowns, with reduced mobility and with increases in illness, spending much more of their time in care. And there are some countries, including here in the US, where we're really afraid that women are not going to be able to return to the labor market unless we see care, child care, particularly as economic infrastructure. Countries can't recover. And finally, we have to pay attention to education.